You were saying that the upper class have ethnocentric values as well as the working class, but the middle class has values that are more individualistic. And there has been upward social mobility of the middle class, which displaced the traditional upper class, and has therefore left us in a situation where we're not ethnocentric enough.
This is based on an observation from Gregory Clark's work. And Gregory Clark is the gentleman who showed that over many generations you had downward social mobility among the higher classes. They reproduced to excess. And because there was very high levels of mortality among those below them in the socio-economic status hierarchy, you'd have downward social mobility among the less able descendants. So these may be younger sons of younger sons of younger sons, and they would eventually come to replace by this trickle-down effect the working classes, except in so doing they will bootstrap the working classes. They'll actually raise the average level of traits like intelligence among the working classes, which pulls the whole society up by its bootstraps essentially. And this is because society in successive generations comes to be dominated by the descendants of downwardly socially mobile members of the former middle class. One of the things these members of the middle class were doing, in addition to being downwardly socially mobile, was being upwardly socially mobile, but to a somewhat lesser extent. They were being upwardly socially mobile insofar as they were basically replacing the old aristocracies. Because the same data that Clark brings to bear on the question of downward mobility among the middle classes also shows a little upward social mobility too. So the old aristocracy went extinct. I mean, it didn't go extinct, it thinned, essentially. And it was replaced by a middle class people who came up to replace the old aristocracy. So you can see all peerages, baronetcies and things, which were created in the 18th and 19th century, the newer creations, tended to be created for people who were not connected to the great noble houses of the UK. They were middle class people, politicians, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, etc. So it's a little bit both ways. Now, one of the traits that is conducive to middle-class reproductive success may well have been individualism, and it may well have been this work ethic value that meant you got the selection for a cosmopolitan phenotype, so one which has less of a sense of place.
Sorry, can I stop you there? I've been thinking about this as well. You've got this feudal society, this society of chivalrous knightly values, of ethnocentrism, where everyone's in a hierarchy of almost gang warfare, and the person at the top looks after you in return for you being a knight for him, and then you're a yeoman for that knight, in return for him looking after you in a system of gang loyalty of fealty. And you're saying that the middle class becomes a separate thing and starts to dominate by what breaking with this?
Well, what I'm saying is the middle class are essentially bred for high levels of individualism. They have an aspirational value system, which can broadly be linked with values like cosmopolitanism and individualism. And these values are really, really good if you're industrious and you want to strike out on your own and you want to be innovative and you want to create novel things and you want to go out and spread around and go to different parts of the world and set up enterprises in other parts of the world. And this, by the way, is what the middle classes were doing in Britain and in the Netherlands as well, which is a bioculturally very similar country to England, at the beginning of the 19th century. You can see their convergence because both countries had East and West Indies companies, which were corporate entities, which basically ran the empires. These were informal modes of imperialism, which were dominated by a middle class, which was essentially driven by an interest in profit and material accumulation. Notice, you don't have those values among the old aristocracy of Britain, where the idea was that the aristocrats were paternalistic. The aristocrats managed people on the land and had this paternalistic value system, which is broadly construed under the rubric of something called high Toryism. And the high Tory value system, it emphasizes this idea place and continuity and land and rootedness, etc. And it looks down on commercial enterprise, and it looks down on what are regarded as squalid and petty little interests and things like money. And on the continent, the old aristocracies of the continent have formal systems to stop them from getting involved in business. So, it used to be in Spain they had a system where if you chose to engage in mercantile activity, you were actually stripped of your noble status. It was considered a deadly sin, essentially. And there were formal mechanisms which actually prevented members of the aristocratic class from engaging in middle-class type behaviours and commerce. Now moving to the lower classes. The lower classes, the working classes, have always tended towards a more sense of place type mindset. You can see this in the value systems that they espouse even today. They tend to favour populism, they tend to favour patriotism, even during World War I, which was very illustrative, because in World War I you had a situation in which Marx and Engels wrongly thought the working classes would divide along class lines. But in reality, they divided along ethnic lines.
Can I stop you there? That's where I find it a little bit confusing in this model, because the working class are constantly changing, according to this idea that you're proposing. The working class are constantly being replaced with middle-class people. So the people that were serfs, let's say in the 13th century, were being replaced with middle-class descendants. So they wouldn't have left much of a genetic contribution to today's population. So since values are heritable, why didn't middle-class values completely replace working-class values?
Well, the majority of modern contemporary working class people are going to be descended from reproductively successful middle class people from previous centuries. The difference between them and the current middle class is a matter of conjecture. But one thing we do know is the value system that they express. It became very obvious in World War I that a general strike, this Marxist fantasy about the workers of the world uniting with one another to make common cause against capitalists, and aristocrats who were leading essentially from the front in World War I. The idea was that the German workers in the trenches would make common cause with the British workers in the trenches, and they would unite and turn on the officers. So there'd be this mass fragging event, essentially, which would trigger the revolution. This is what Engels believed. And of course that failed. So Lenin had to confect several new stages of history, like imperialism and fascism and all this other stuff, which he said created false consciousness among the workers and prevented them from realizing their true class interests. So it became apparent at that point, although I dare say the value system is much older than that members of the working classes in Europe were more patriotic and saw themselves as having more in common with their officer corps, many of whom were drawn from the old aristocracy, than they did with the working classes of an entirely different country. And from a genetic similarity theory standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Because based on calculation of the relative versus absolute degrees of genetic differentiation, members of the working class in the UK are going to be more genetically similar on average to members of the aristocratic class when you compare to members of the working classes in Germany or the Netherlands. The relative genetic distance between them is going to be very high when compared to foreign working classes. So, at the level of fitness payoffs, it makes sense that this mode of cooperation should exist. But it also illustrates that there are these values among the working classes who, by the way, still contribute disproportionately to our armed forces. The armed forces still they still recruit disproportionately from the working classes in Western countries. So, there's something about working class people which make them very patriotic, very dutiful-mindedness, high levels of dutifulness. And they also have an extremely strong desire to basically protect the common weal, to protect the common good. And that's about as far as I got with thinking about this model and developing it. So, I don't really have much more to say about it, I'm afraid. It's a model which requires proper testing, and we need proper data. It's all very well engaging in conjecture on this, but conjecture it is, and that's what needs to be stated.
Yes, of course. But I don't quite get the idea of the working class having more similar values to the upper class than to the middle class. Would that be a matter of environment or relative poverty? So you've got two different factors pushing the upper and lower classes in an ethnocentric direction. If you're poor at the bottom of society. There's evidence that poverty correlates with ethnocentrism, that low IQ correlates with ethnocentrism, that the working class have these ethnocentric values for environmental epigenetic reasons. And it's the upper class that are a kind of preserved caste that have them more for genetic reasons. Would that be possible?
The answer is, I don't know. But I suspect that most things have a genetic basis, and that in this instance, we will probably find some genetic variants which are conserved. They're conserved across these social groups, but which are absent in the middle, so that would be one possibility. I mean, one thing we know is that IQ, which is obviously positively associated with socioeconomic status, is also negatively associated with certain forms of ethnocentrism, which suggests that, at least within the normal range of the population, most of these sense of place values, these anti-cosmopolitan values, are going to be more heavily concentrated among those with lower socioeconomic status. It could be that there's even something about the old working classes which never fully went extinct, which survived and persisted. And despite being diluted by downward genetic movement from the middle classes into the working classes, it never got diluted away completely. So, what you may be seeing there is the old peasantry still there, still among the working classes. But, again, this is something that we need actual proper genetic data to test. You can only go so far with surnames, which is what Gregory Clark likes to say.